George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, at Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was the first of 6 children born to Mary Ball Washington and her husband, Augustine Washington, a tobacco planter. Tragically, Augustine died when George was just 11, ending any plans for the boy to receive a gentleman's education in England. As a teenager, George was guided by his eldest half-brother, Lawrence, and the influential Fairfax family next door, who taught him practical skills like surveying land and managing plantations. When Lawrence died of tuberculosis in 1752, George inherited the family's Little Hunting Creek plantation, later renamed Mount Vernon, and a small number of enslaved laborers. He had once dreamed of joining the British Navy, but his mother vetoed the plan, fearing the dangers of life at sea. Instead, George turned his ambitions westward. By age 17, he had secured a commission as a land surveyor and eventually mapped over 60,000 acres on the Virginia frontier. In his early 20s, Washington entered military service just as tensions between Britain and France were escalating in North America. In 1753, the royal governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, sent 21-year-old Major Washington on a dangerous mission to the Ohio Valley to deliver a warning to the French. Washington's party endured freezing forests and harsh terrain, but he completed the mission. Though the French rejected the message, Washington came away convinced of their intent to seize the region. His report of French fortifications contributed to the hostility between the British and the French at the time. In 1754, Washington was promoted to lieutenant colonel and sent back to the frontier with a regiment of Virginia militia. That May, his troops ambushed a French-Canadian unit in what is now Pennsylvania, killing several men, including their commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, a diplomatic envoy. In response, the French surrounded Washington's troops at Fort Necessity and forced him to surrender. Unaware that the French written surrender document included an admission of guilt for Jumonville's death, Washington signed it, creating a public opinion scandal, with Washington being blamed for firing some of the first shots of the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the global 7 Years' War. In 1755, Washington volunteered as aide to British General Edward Braddock, who led a disastrous expedition against Fort Duquesne. During the Battle of Monongahela, Washington narrowly escaped death multiple times. Accounts say his coat was pierced by bullets, but he rallied the survivors and fought bravely, earning acclaim as a hero. At just 23, he was promoted to colonel and given command of all Virginia forces. For some years, he oversaw Virginia's frontier defense but eventually resigned in 1758, frustrated with British military leadership and plagued by illness. In early 1759, he married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 children. The marriage brought great wealth, along with 84 enslaved people, to Mount Vernon, making Washington one of Virginia's wealthiest planters. Still, like many landowners, Washington was burdened with debt to British merchants and increasingly resented British economic policies. That year, he entered public life as a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. When Britain imposed new taxes to recoup war debts, Washington joined his fellow Burgesses in protesting what they viewed as unjust taxation without representation. In 1774, after Parliament shut down Boston Harbor and revoked Massachusetts' local governance, Washington was chosen as a delegate to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. By spring 1775, war had broken out. Washington arrived at the Second Continental Congress in full militia uniform, signaling readiness to lead. On June 14, Congress created the Continental Army, and the next day, Washington was unanimously appointed commander-in-chief. That summer, he took command of the New England militia besieging Boston. Washington's first glimpse of his army was sobering, as his men lacked training, discipline, and even basic equipment. Despite the difficulties, showing both decisiveness and cunning, Washington sent Henry Knox on a midwinter mission to haul captured heavy cannons from Fort Ticonderoga in New York to Boston. In March 1776, Washington's men secretly emplaced this artillery on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston Harbor, threatening the British fleet. The British commander, seeing his position become untenable overnight, evacuated Boston without a fight. This early victory boosted American morale and validated Washington's leadership. After Boston, Washington shifted his army to defend New York City in the summer of 1776, only to suffer a string of defeats. The British, superior in numbers and naval support, flanked Washington's troops on Long Island and Manhattan, forcing the Americans to retreat across New Jersey. By the end of 1776, morale in the Patriot cause was near collapse. In this dark hour, Washington decided on a bold stroke to revive American spirits. On Christmas night 1776, he led a ragtag column across the ice-choked Delaware River, surprising a Hessian, German mercenary, garrison at Trenton and capturing nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers. A few days later, with clever deception, he slipped away from a British counterattack and struck a British rearguard at Princeton, winning another sharp victory. Though small in scale, these back-to-back wins in the 10 Days campaign proved electrifying. They restored confidence that the revolution had life in it yet, just when one half of Washington's army was about to melt away at year's end as enlistments expired. Washington's reputation for boldness and resilience was sealed. In 1777, failing to draw the Continental Army into battle in North Jersey, British General William Hull landed his men at the northern end of the Chesapeake Bay and defeated Washington at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, which left the way open to capture Philadelphia, then the American capital. That winter, Washington's army set camp at Valley Forge, where it endured horrific privation. Nearly 2,000 of his soldiers died from cold, hunger, and disease in the winter encampment of 1777-78. Washington himself stayed with the army through the ordeal, sharing the hardships. He refused to live in comfort while his men shivered in huts, and this steadfast loyalty endeared him to the troops. Amid the misery, Washington reorganized supply systems and, with the help of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian volunteer who drilled the army, transformed raw recruits into a tougher, more professional force. In June 1778, Washington's rejuvenated army was tested at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. The battle was essentially a draw, but the British withdrew, and the Continental Army demonstrated it could stand up to regulars in open combat. Feeling stuck in the north, the British shifted their main operations to the south, hoping to rally loyalist support, but a brutal guerrilla campaign led by American General Nathaniel Greene wore down British Lord Cornwallis's army. Cornwallis retreated to the Virginia coast at Yorktown, seeking resupply by the British Navy. Learning that Admiral de Grasse would sail to the Chesapeake Bay, Washington hurried south from New York along with French General Rochambeau's forces. With de Grasse's fleet defeating the British Navy, American-French forces trapped Cornwallis on the Yorktown Peninsula and besieged his fortifications. On October 17, 1781, Cornwallis's force of over 7,000 surrendered, effectively ending the war. Even after Yorktown, Washington kept the army intact for 2 more years, until peace was secured. In 1783, as the Treaty of Paris neared completion, the Newburgh Conspiracy tested his loyalty to civilian rule. Angry over unpaid wages, some officers contemplated a coup and even suggested the idea of making Washington a monarch or a dictator. At a tense meeting, he addressed them, pausing to put on glasses, something his men had never seen him wear. "Gentlemen," he apologized, "you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself going blind." This simple gesture moved the battle-hardened officers to tears and ended the conspiracy. With the war truly over and American independence secured, on December 23, 1783, Washington resigned his commission as commander-in-chief, surrendering his military powers to Congress. In an age of conquering generals and would-be tyrants, Washington's voluntary return to private life was hailed around the world. But America's post-war government soon faltered. Under the weak Articles of Confederation, economic strife, unpaid debts, and border threats mounted. In 1787, a constitutional convention was convened, and Washington was unanimously chosen to preside. In this role, Washington did not actively debate the particulars of the new constitution, but his mere presence lent credibility and gravitas to the gathering. Over that sweltering summer, the convention crafted the United States Constitution, establishing a stronger federal government with separate executive, legislative, and judicial branches. As expected, once the states ratified the Constitution, all eyes turned to George Washington as the obvious choice to be the first president of the United States. In early 1789, the Electoral College unanimously elected Washington as president, the only U.S. president ever so honored. He was inaugurated in New York City on April 30 that year. He served 2 terms as president, laying the foundations of the U.S. federal government. Nearly every action he took set a precedent, as there was no roadmap for how a president should conduct the office. One of his first notable acts was creating a cabinet of senior advisors. He found he needed regular counsel from the heads of the executive departments and appointed luminaries to these posts: Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. He also set up the federal judiciary by signing the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established the U.S. Supreme Court and a system of federal courts. Washington carefully selected the first justices, striving to choose distinguished men from different regions to reinforce national unity. Managing the nation's finances was another immediate challenge. Washington largely endorsed Treasury Secretary Hamilton's ambitious economic program to stabilize the infant republic's economy. This included federal assumption of state Revolutionary War debts, the creation of a national bank, and encouragement of domestic manufacturing. The proposal for a first Bank of the United States sparked fierce debate and the first major constitutional question: did the federal government have authority to create a bank? Secretary of State Jefferson argued vehemently against it as unconstitutional, while Hamilton defended it with a broad interpretation of federal powers. Washington weighed their written opinions and ultimately sided with Hamilton, signing the bank bill into law in 1791. In doing so, Washington presided over the birth of the American party system, as his 2 chief advisors became the figureheads of opposing political factions: the Federalists, led by Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson. On the domestic front, Washington crushed the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 by personally leading 12,000 militia, proving federal authority could enforce the law. It was the first and only time a sitting U.S. president led troops in the field. By the time the army arrived, the rebellion had collapsed without significant bloodshed. In foreign affairs, as war broke out between Britain and revolutionary France in 1793, Jeffersonians, siding with France, and Hamiltonians, siding with Britain, divided public opinion. Washington, however, believed the nation was too young and weak to be entangled in Europe's wars. In April that year, he issued a proclamation of neutrality, establishing the principle that the United States should chart its own course internationally, avoiding binding alliances and intense foreign partisanship. Throughout his administration, Washington was adamant about avoiding monarchic symbols and insisted on being called by the modest title of Mr. President. He also made a point of exercising the veto sparingly and referred major decisions to Congress when appropriate. One of his final and most enduring acts was establishing the tradition of a two-term limit for presidents. By 1796, Washington was exhausted by years of partisan strife and longing for home. He had initially planned to retire after one term, but his closest advisors urged him to serve a second term to stabilize the nation. On March 4, 1797, refusing to run for a third term, he handed over the presidency to John Adams and joyfully rode home to Virginia. In retirement, Washington tried to resume the life of a gentleman farmer and landowner on his sprawling estate. Ever the meticulous manager, Washington rose before dawn to inspect his farms on horseback each day, kept detailed accounts, and corresponded about agricultural innovations. Mindful of his legacy and the future beyond his lifetime, in 1799, he drew up a new will that reflected both his sense of responsibility and evolving conscience. Aside from bequests to Martha and his extended family, Washington's will notably hinted at a change in his moral views on slavery by freeing all 123 enslaved people he owned upon Martha's death. Washington's final days came suddenly. On December 12, 1799, after a ride in sleet and snow, Washington developed a severe throat infection. Despite desperate medical treatments, including bleeding, blisters, and purgatives, he died on December 14, aged 67. The nation was stunned by the loss of its paramount hero. In the weeks that followed, memorial processions, church services, and orations took place in all major cities. His funeral was held at Mount Vernon on December 18, a simple ceremony per his wishes, with a local militia and clergy presiding as his body was placed in the family vault overlooking the Potomac. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deeper look at the first president of the United States, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you don't miss the next journey through history. See you next time.